The town meeting happened on a Tuesday evening in March 1894, and nearly every adult in Millbrook turned out to witness what they'd been anticipating for weeks: the official expulsion of Jacob Thornton from the community that had tolerated him for 3 years and had finally decided enough was enough. The meeting was held in the church because it was the only building large enough to hold 200 angry people, and the irony of using a house of God to condemn a man wasn't lost on anyone, but apparently didn't matter enough to change the venue. Jacob stood at the front of the church facing the crowd, listening to a litany of grievances that had been building since he'd arrived in Millbrook in 1891, and had made himself progressively more unpopular with each passing month. The charges against Jacob Thornton were numerous and damning in their cumulative weight, even if individually they seemed petty. He'd refused to contribute to the community barn raising in 1892, citing his belief that people should build their own barns instead of relying on communal labor. He'd opposed the school tax increase, arguing loudly at town council meetings that education was a family responsibility, not a community obligation. He'd filed complaints against neighbors whose livestock wandered onto his property, demanding compensation for crop damage in amounts that seemed designed to antagonize rather than reimburse. He'd objected to the church bell ringing on Sunday mornings, claiming it disturbed his peace. He'd criticized the volunteer fire brigade as inefficient and wasteful. He'd opposed road improvements, charity drives, community celebrations, and basically every collective effort that Millbrook attempted to organize. What made Jacob Thornton particularly insufferable was that he was often technically correct in his criticisms. The barn raising had been somewhat disorganized. The school tax increase was substantial. Wandering livestock did cause legitimate crop damage. The fire brigade could have been more efficient. But being technically correct while being socially destructive was a combination that frontier communities had no patience for, and Millbrook had reached its limit with a man who seemed determined to oppose community solidarity on principle. The town council president, a respected farmer named William Hayes, had read the formal resolution that the council had drafted and the community had endorsed through near unanimous vote. Jacob Thornton has demonstrated through his actions and statements that he does not share the values of mutual support and collective welfare that define this community. He has opposed efforts to improve our schools, our infrastructure, and our community bonds. He has prioritized his individual rights over community needs repeatedly and unapologetically. Therefore, the Millbrook Town Council, with the support of this community, formally requests that Jacob Thornton leave Millbrook within 30 days. This is not a legal expulsion. We lack the authority to force him to leave. But it is a clear statement that he is no longer welcome here, that his presence is detrimental to community harmony, and that we as a community are exercising our right to disassociate from someone whose values are incompatible with ours. The crowd had cheered, genuinely cheered. 200 people who'd been frustrated with Jacob Thornton for 3 years, expressing their relief that he was finally being told to leave. Some had shouted agreement, some had applauded. A few had called out specific grievances, reminding everyone of particular instances where Jacob had been difficult or contrary or deliberately obstinate. It had been a moment of collective catharsis, of a community purging an irritant and celebrating the restoration of harmony. Jacob Thornton had stood there and taken it, his face showing the complex emotions of a man who believed he was right, being told by everyone around him that right didn't matter as much as getting along. When the cheering died down, he'd been given a chance to respond. His response had been brief and bitter. "I came to Millbrook believing it was a free community where a man could speak his mind and manage his own affairs without being forced to subsidize everyone else's wants with his own labor and money. I was wrong. This is a community that values conformity over principle, that punishes independence, that demands participation in collective efforts regardless of individual belief. You're not expelling me for being wrong. You're expelling me for being unwilling to pretend I agree with things I don't agree with. I'll leave, but don't pretend this is about community values. This is about enforcing compliance. He'd walked out of the church to more cheers, had returned to his farm, and had spent the next 30 days preparing to leave Millbrook for somewhere that might tolerate a man who valued individual liberty over collective harmony. He'd sold his land to William Hayes at below market value because Hayes was the only buyer willing to purchase from someone the community was expelling. He'd packed his belongings, arranged transport, and left Millbrook on April 15th, 1894, riding out of town on a wagon loaded with everything he owned and nothing like regret. Millbrook had celebrated his departure with a community dinner, had toasted to restored harmony, had congratulated themselves on handling a difficult situation maturely, had moved forward with their community projects without Jacob's constant opposition and criticism. For 6 months, Millbrook had functioned exactly as they'd hoped it would function without Jacob Thornton. Then the trouble started. It began with small things. The school tax increase that Jacob had opposed turned out to fund a poorly planned expansion that ran over budget and required a second tax increase that people grumbled about but paid because they'd already committed to the first increase. The road improvement project that Jacob had questioned turned out to benefit primarily the wealthy landowners on the east side of town while doing nothing for the west side farmers who'd paid equal taxes for it. The community barn that had been built with volunteer labor started showing structural problems within 6 months because the design had been rushed and nobody had wanted to slow down the project by raising concerns that might seem like Jacob-style obstruction. By October, Millbrook was dealing with consequences of decisions that had been made without the critical voice that had seemed so annoying when it was present. The town council had started making choices based on consensus and enthusiasm rather than careful analysis, because careful analysis felt too much like the kind of negative criticism that Jacob had specialized in. And without someone willing to ask uncomfortable questions or point out potential problems, Millbrook had enthusiastically pursued several projects that turned out to be poorly conceived. The real crisis came in November when a traveling banker named Samuel Ketchum arrived in Millbrook with a proposal that seemed too good to refuse. Ketchum represented a railroad development company that was planning a spur line through central Kansas. If Millbrook would invest $20,000 in municipal bonds to support the railroad construction, the company would guarantee that Millbrook became a depot stop, which would mean economic development and property value increases that would more than justify the investment. The town council had presented this opportunity to the community at a meeting that generated enormous enthusiasm. A railroad depot meant jobs, commerce, growth, prosperity. $20,000 was a substantial sum, but if every property owner contributed proportionally, it was manageable, and the returns would be worth it. William Hayes, as council president, had advocated strongly for the investment. Other council members had agreed. The community meeting had voted overwhelmingly to approve the bond issuance. A few people had raised questions about verifying Ketchum's credentials or investigating the railroad company's legitimacy, but those questions had been dismissed as excessive caution that might cause Millbrook to miss a valuable opportunity. After all, Ketchum had impressive documentation and persuasive testimonials from other towns that had made similar investments. Millbrook had raised $20,000 through bond sales and property liens and had handed the money to Samuel Ketchum in December 1894 with great optimism about the prosperity that railroad access would bring. Ketchum had promised construction would begin in spring 1895 and had ridden out of Millbrook with their money and their hopes. By February 1895, people were starting to ask questions. By March, those questions became urgent. By April, a delegation had traveled to the state capitol to investigate the Railroad Development Company and had discovered that it didn't exist, that Samuel Ketchum was a confidence man who'd run the same scheme in 4 other Kansas towns, and that Millbrook's $20,000 was gone, along with Ketchum and any hope of recovering it. The town meeting in May 1895 was nothing like the triumphant gathering that had expelled Jacob Thornton 14 months earlier. This meeting was somber and desperate, 200 people facing financial ruin because they'd invested everything in a fraud that careful scrutiny might have exposed. The questions that a few people had raised about verifying Ketchum's credentials had been dismissed as the kind of negative obstruction that sounded too much like Jacob Thornton's constant criticism. And now those unasked questions had cost Millbrook everything. William Hayes, who'd been instrumental in both expelling Jacob and advocating for the railroad investment, stood before the same community that had cheered Jacob's departure and admitted what everyone already knew. "We were deceived," he said. "Ketchum was a fraud. The railroad company was fake. Our $20,000 is gone. We have no legal recourse because we have no jurisdiction over a criminal who's probably in another state by now. And we have no financial reserves because we invested everything in something we didn't properly investigate." The silence that followed was broken by someone asking the question everyone was thinking: what do we do now? Hayes had no answer because there was no good answer. Millbrook was ruined. Property values had collapsed because of the liens. Families who'd contributed their savings had nothing left. The bonds they'd issued would default because the promised railroad revenue would never materialize. The town was facing bankruptcy and dissolution and the scattering of a community that had been thriving 18 months ago. That was when Jacob Thornton rode back into Millbrook. He came on a Saturday morning in late May, riding the same wagon he'd left on, looking no different than he had when the community had cheered his expulsion. He rode straight to the church, where a community meeting was being held to discuss bankruptcy proceedings, and he walked in without invitation or announcement. The reaction was complex: shock, embarrassment, anger, fear. Nobody knew why he was there, but his presence felt like judgment, made physical, like a ghost returning to a place that had tried to forget him. William Hayes had found his voice first. "Jacob, you're not welcome here. The community voted to expel you. You left. You have no business returning." Jacob had walked to the front of the church, the same position he'd stood in when being expelled, and had surveyed the crowd with an expression that mixed vindication and something that might have been pity. "I'm aware I'm not welcome," he'd said. "I'm also aware that this community is facing financial collapse because nobody was willing to ask the questions I would have asked about Samuel Ketchum's railroad scheme. I'm here because I have information that might help you recover at least some of what you lost." He'd pulled documents from his coat, spread them on the table in front of the council. "I've been tracking Ketchum since I heard what happened here. I have contacts in 3 other towns he defrauded. I've been corresponding with territorial law enforcement. I know where Ketchum is, and I know where he's planning to run his next scheme. This documentation provides everything you need to work with a federal marshal to apprehend him and potentially recover funds before he spends everything he stole. The church had been silent, processing this information. Hayes had found his voice again. Why? He'd asked. Why help a community that expelled you? Why spend your time tracking down a criminal who defrauded people who threw you out? Jacob had been honest in a way that hurt, because you were wrong to expel me, but you don't deserve to be destroyed for being wrong. Because this community raised me and educated me and gave me opportunities, even though we disagreed about almost everything. Because helping you doesn't require me to pretend you were right to throw me out, or to pretend I was wrong to oppose your projects. We can both be what we are. You can be a community that values collective action and dislikes independent criticism. I can be someone who values individual liberty and questions collective enthusiasm. And I can still help when you need help, because that's what decent people do, even when they don't like each other. He'd placed additional documents on the table. I've also brought something else. I sold my land to you, William, for $8,000, below market value, because you were the only buyer. That money is sitting in a bank in Topeka earning interest. I'm donating it to Millbrook to help settle the bond debts. It won't cover everything, but it'll help prevent some families from losing their homes. The silence that followed was different than the cheering that had accompanied his expulsion. This was shame and gratitude and recognition that the man they'd expelled for being difficult had returned to save them from consequences of the very kind of uncritical enthusiasm that had made him unwelcome. Hayes had tried to refuse. We can't accept your money after what we did. Jacob had been firm. You can and you will. Not because you deserve it, because the alternative is families losing homes and children losing futures, and I won't let that happen because adults made bad decisions. He'd looked around the church at people who cheered when he left. I'm giving you this help. I'm not asking to be welcomed back. I'm not asking you to admit you were wrong to expel me. I'm asking you to learn that the person who asks uncomfortable questions and opposes popular ideas isn't always your enemy. Sometimes they're the person who saves you from yourself. With Jacob's documentation, Millbrook had worked with federal marshals to apprehend Samuel Ketchum in Colorado Territory before he could run his next scheme. They'd recovered approximately $12,000 of the $20,000 stolen, enough combined with Jacob's $8,000 donation to prevent complete community collapse. Millbrook had survived, diminished but intact, having learned an expensive lesson about the difference between disagreement and destruction, between criticism and enemy. Jacob had ridden back out of Millbrook after providing his help, had returned to whatever life he'd built in the 14 months since being expelled. The community had tried to thank him, had tried to apologize, had tried to invite him to return. He'd declined all of it. I helped because it was right, he'd said, not because I wanted reconciliation. You're still a community that values conformity over independence. I'm still someone who values independence over conformity. We're incompatible. But incompatibility doesn't require cruelty. You can be what you are. I can be what I am. We can leave each other alone and still do right by each other when it matters. Here's what's worth understanding about frontier communities and the people they excluded. The most dangerous belief was that disagreement meant disloyalty, that criticism meant destruction, that the person who questioned collective decisions was automatically working against collective good. Millbrook had expelled Jacob Thornton because his constant criticism was annoying and inconvenient and made community projects harder to pursue with enthusiasm. But that same critical voice would have asked the questions about Samuel Ketchum that would have exposed the fraud before Millbrook invested $20,000 in nothing. 19 towns now, and in one of them, a community that had cheered when they threw out their critic had learned that the irritating voice asking uncomfortable questions was sometimes the voice that saved them from disaster. Jacob Thornton had been right to oppose poor planning and uncritical enthusiasm. Millbrook had been right to value community bonds and collective action. Both positions had merit. The tragedy was believing they couldn't coexist, that expelling the critic would make community easier when actually it just made poor decisions more likely. Tell me something before you go. Where in the world are you hearing this story right now? Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far this trail reaches. And if you want to keep riding, if you want to know what happens when the expelled critic returns to save the community that cast him out, the story is waiting for you on the screen right now. Watch it. The road stretched toward wherever Jacob Thornton had built his new life. And somewhere behind him, Millbrook was rebuilding on foundations of harder-won wisdom. They'd cheered when they threw him out. They'd been silent and ashamed when he returned to save them. And they'd learned that the person who disagrees isn't always wrong, that criticism isn't always destruction, that sometimes the most valuable member of a community is the one who's willing to be unpopular by asking questions nobody wants to answer. I'll see you on the trail.